Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast. In this episode, what I wanted to do is give you kind of a preview of a presentation that I'm going to be giving next week for the Netherlands Olympic team, Team NL. They've asked me to give a presentation on the constraints-led approach. So obviously, I have lots of episodes related to the constraints-led approach on the podcast, but I thought this would be useful to give you an idea about how I currently think about and how I use the constraints-led approach in my own practice. So I wanted to go through that here. And this will be part of a all-day seminar that covers a lot of different methods, including implicit learning, differential learning, using different foci of attention, transfer training, and things like that. So that gives you an idea of what this is. So this is the constraints-led approach. So to start off with, I want to dispel a couple points of confusion and misunderstandings people have about this approach. First of all, I'd like to point out that all the methods you're going to hear about today and every coaching method ever invented involves constraints manipulations, right? As they're defined by Carl Newell in his model of constraints, his theory of constraints, cons- everything in the that a coach can do in practice involves a constraints manipulation. All equipment is constraints. The number of players, the field size, your instructions are constraints, right? All of those are constraints. So constraints manipulations have been used forever, right? That's the only thing you can do. Um, they're currently used in all methods, even prescriptive traditional coaching is a constraints manipulation. The difference lies in what the goal of the constraints manipulation is, right? What is the purpose of manipulating constraints in practice, right? What is the purpose of what you say, the equipment you give the athlete to do, whether you use blocked or versus random practice, et cetera, and so on. The idea is that in the ecological approach, which I lump together, which I include constraints-led approach and differential learning under that umbrella. I'm going to talk about constraints-led approach here. The idea is that we're using constraints to encourage self-organization, right? To encourage the athlete to find a different movement solutions that's going to be more effective and be able to be adaptable to different constraints. Okay. So that's kind of one thing I like to point out. So this is a figure I took off, it was on Twitter just before I made the presentation, right? This is adding constraints. It's not the constraints-led approach, right? Adding all these different things, the purpose of these things is to get you to do an ideal swing, right? Get you to swing in one particular way. It's not really allowing for or guiding self-organization. It's prescriptive. It's telling you swing like this by putting lots of obstacles and things in your way, so you have to. So I would not call this the constraints-led approach. So just adding a bunch of things to practice is not the constraints-led approach. Other kind of things I like to kind of so obviously, right, the constraints-led approach is the main methodology that comes from the ecological dynamics model of skill, right? And I've gone through this lots of times in my podcast as well, right? The key assumption in the ecological dynamics model is that skillful movement emerges from a process of self-organization, which is shaped by the constraints, the individual, the task, and the environmental constraints. Skill is not about learning a particular solution, learning a motor program, whatever you want, something stored in your head that you're going to pull out later, like a technique that you're going to pull out later. Instead, in ecological dynamics, we consider skill to be a problem-solving activity, right? And you can think of the best way to think of this probably is from Bernstein's perspective, right? Skill involves having dexterity. That is to find a movement solution that will allow you to achieve your goal in the face of an ever-changing set of constraints, right? Whether in the external environment or the internal environment, right? So those are the main kind of theoretical basis of ecological dynamics. There's other things like direct perception, affordances, but I won't go into it. Those are the key ones I want to focus on today. Okay. And of course, within this is fundamental to this is Bernstein's idea of repetition without repetition, right? The fundamental change in the way we think, we don't repeat an outcome like consistently getting the ball in the hoop by repeating the movement, right? We repeat the outcome without repeating the movement. That's what repetition without repetition means, right? In order to successfully make the same outcome over and over again under ever-changing constraints, fatigue, player in your face, different spot on the floor, different feel, different lots of different constraints changes, I have to continually be able to adapt my movement solution. Right? I can't use the same one over and over again. It's not going to work. So because of that, we're going to focus on different things in practice. We're going to focus on developing this dexterity and this adaptability in practice right from the start, instead of focusing on drilling this solution into you that you can pull out later. Okay. So those are the fundamental assumptions. Okay. Repetition of outcome does not involve repetition of movement. Okay. So the metaphor that I like to use now when I talk about constraints-led approach to coaches is that constraints-led approach involves guided self-organization. Okay. We're going to allow the athlete to self-organize, right? We allow the athlete's body, their motor, perceptual motor system to figure out the details, right? But we're not just going to stand back and let them do whatever they want. We're not just going to stand back and say nothing and let them struggle if they can't find a solution or any kind of success in the skill. We're not going to throw, as a coach, we're not going to throw away all our years and years of knowledge and experience watching athletes and not our knowledge about what a good movement solution is for that particular skill, right? We're going to use that to guide the athlete through constraints manipulations, including instructions that are just going to help them find a movement solution, right? And the key thing I like to think, we're not going to give them the solution. We're going to create problems in practice that helps them find their own solution. Okay, that's the fundamental difference. That's a fundamental thing we're trying to achieve with the constraint-set approach. Okay. So what are constraints, right? So why do we call them constraints? I know it can be a confusing term for a lot of people. We call it constraints. A constraint, here's how I defined it. A feature of an individual task or environment that takes away some of the movement solutions that can be used. Why is this important, right? Because of the multiple degrees of freedom in our body, there are numerous possible, almost an infinite number of movement solutions we could use. If we count all the different ways we can program the forces and movements of the joints in our body, um, taking away some of these kind of paradoxically makes it easier for the observer, right? Human beings are not good with a lot of choice. This is obviously a different kind of choice. The example I always give is a microwave, right? Microwave has a million buttons on it, all these different levels of defrost and heat, and blah, 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 blah. Most people use the popcorn button and the time button. That's it, right? Because they don't want to deal with all that choice, right? Well-designed constraints guide a performer toward a solution that the coach will think be more effective than they are now, right? So the coach is using their knowledge about what an effective solution is, but they're not prescribing one for the same for everyone, right? They're using kind of more general knowledge to help guide the athlete and let the athlete self-organize and figure out the specifics themselves, right? That's the fundamental difference with the constraint-set approach, okay? Here's a figure I can created a while ago, right? And it's on this webpage that I created for the constraint-set approach. What I think are the key features of the constraint-set approach. The four key goals, examples of some research and different types. So the four key goals, let me go. The first thing we're going to do with the constraint-set approach is what we want to do is we want to destabilize the existing non-optimal movement pattern, right? So I'm going to show you some examples in a second, but we want to start with a movement solution that's not effective, right? Critically, we're not starting with a movement solution just because it looks different, right? There's a reason why we want to change it, either for performance or injury. We'll see often, I think those go hand in hand, right? So we're going to destabilize an existing non-optimal movement solution. So the question I always say for coaches to start with, if you have something your athlete is doing that you don't like, you want them to do something different, ask yourself, what can I add to practice that's going to make that current solution not effective, right? If I add this to practice, what they're doing now is no longer going to work. That's the whole idea of the constraint-set approach. You're adding something to practice, a constraint that is causing them to go out and explore for a new movement solution. Okay. Point number two, you're encouraging exploration and self-organization. You're not telling them what to do instead. You're letting them find that solution themselves. You're guiding them, maybe with an instruction here and there. Why don't you try bending your knees more, I know that sounds new, but that's a guide. I think you're not telling them they have to do that. You're giving them a suggestion about what they might try. 3.3, you're amplifying information and inviting affordances. If you use constraints effectively, you can create an environment where there are opportunities. The solution, there's opportunities are kind of screaming out at the athlete for what they can do instead of what they're doing now, right? I'll show you some examples of that. And the fourth one is provide transition feedback. Transition feedback is a concept developed by Carl Newell. It's different than knowledge of performance or knowledge of results feedback because it's not feedback about your current performance, how effective it is in achieving your goal, or some aspect of the process of your current performance. It's feedback about your search. Is your search for a new movement solution going in the right direction, right? And the related concept that David Jacobs and Claire Michaels talk about is information for learning. Is there information that could tell you about whether your search for a new movement solution is effective? And I'll show you an example of this as I get when we go on. Okay, so let's look at some examples. I'm going to use as examples from my sport that I work in, baseball. Okay. So let me start with this example. This one is I'm going to take from one of our coaches, John Soteropoulos, who worked at Driveline. This is I just picked this one because you can see the article online. It's fully publicly available. Instead of talking about a specific player I'm working with now, this is kind of the illustrates the approach we use. Okay. So the first one, this is designed to look at bat speed. Okay, so we have a player. This player happens to be Lars Nootbaar, who is now with the St. Louis Cardinals, right? So we have a player who has a bat speed of 66 to 69, right? That is well below the MLB average, right? And the faster you swing the bat, the more exit velocity you have on the ball, the higher exit velocity, the more better outcomes you have in hitting, right? It's pretty simple, right? In hitting, if you want to do well, you have to hit the ball hard. Now, that's what every team is looking for, okay? So there's a problem. We can identify a specific problem at the level of performance, right? That's always where I want to start, right? Is what are we trying to change from on a performance level or potentially an injury level, right? That's the motivation. If there's nothing wrong there, if the player is doing the worst ugly swing you've ever seen, but their bat speed is high, leave it alone, right? Leave it alone. It's probably not going to be the case, but don't change things unless there's a good reason. So we do that, and then from there, there's a bunch of things we can do. We can use our knowledge as a coach, look at what we know about a good swing, what has to happen. And also, this is where I think biomechanics come in. This is where we can use biomechanics reports for different types. In this case, the problem John identified was with the player's load, right? The sinking of the load between the pelvis and the torso. The player was not creating enough separation between their hips and shoulders when they were rotating. So we identified a specific problem in there, right? We identify a specific problem in the movement solution. We want to destabilize this and move them away from this, right? All this information, right? We could talk about it with the player. Like I like to do it separately off the field, out of the batting cage. We can talk about this, but this is mostly for the coach to design the constraint, right? We're not going to tell the player you need to think about rotating your hips more than your shoulders, right? That's not going to be effective, right? That's just going to get them all, you know, thinking too much internally about right. We're going to get rid of this. Biomechanics is for a coach to design constraints. That's the main thing it's for, in my opinion. Right. So what John did, what we do, so we go, here's the main effective movement solution we like. We're going to add constraints where we're going to give them a long bat, right? A longer bat, and make them try to pull the ball, hit the ball to right field. That is a task that's almost impossible to do with this type of overcoiling in the swing. We're also going to give him what John calls hook'ems. They're going to make him start in this position, which doesn't allow him to do, right? So what we've done is we've added a constraint in terms of the body position, a constraint in terms of the equipment used, both of which are specifically designed because when we add them, you can't do what you were doing before. So we've destabilized your solution, right? There's no longer, you cannot possibly pull a ball to right field if you're doing this with a long bat. That's the idea, right? We're giving them very clear feedback about their bat speed and where the ball's going when they hit it. And then we're just getting out of the way and letting the athlete self-organize and find their own solution. We're not telling them anything about what we want them to do instead, right? If they continue to struggle, like if when they hit this, they did this a million times and they never put the ball in play, right? We could think about doing something different, adding a different constraint, giving a different construction instruction. That's where the guidance comes in, right? That's what I think of guidance comes in. Okay. So that's one example. So again, we're giving the athlete a new problem, trying to pull the ball with a long bat or trying to hit out of this weird position, which causes them to find a new solution for swinging, right? That's the basic idea of the constraint set approach. Here's another one in pitching, right? So I could show you specific examples of one we work on, but I'll just talk about a general example, right? So this is a common example you see with pitchers called forearm flyout. This is where the body becomes separated from the arm comes separated from their body in the early in the delivery. Basically, they're trying to generate velocity by creating a whip with their arm. You can think of it that way. This does two things. One, it makes paradoxically it makes you throw not as hard because you're breaking the kinetic chain, right? You're taking all this momentum you have built in the big muscles of your body and you're putting it into the little one, right, for a little while, which doesn't it stops the transfer of force effectively. The other thing it does, it massively increases the chance of injury, which anyone pays attention to baseball right now knows is a serious problem, right? They're right. The chance of you're putting all this strain in your poor UCL ligament in your elbow, which is not a good thing, right? So this is the problem. How do we do this? For this we use what's called a connection ball. A connection ball is basically a kid's rubber ball. We make the pitcher hold it under their arm while they're pitching at a target, right? So their main goal is still to pitch for a baseball to their target forward, right? The instruction we give them is pitch the ball so that when this yellow ball falls out, it goes forward, right? What you'll see here, let me show you this. Okay, this is with a younger player doing it. They're using plyo balls in this case, which are right. So if we watch this player do this, so they'll throw. You can see the ball fell out backwards, right? Because the arm separated from the body early, right? So we're not telling them keep your arm against your body, do this. See the ball is going a bit more forward, right? If you keep watching this, he will more and more the ball will go forward as he lets go, right? Um, right. So he cannot possibly make that ball go forward if he's using his old movement solution, right? We're giving him this new problem he has to get to make the ball go forward. He's going back. He's still kind of trying to get it down, okay, to make it go forward. This is the good example of Carl Newell's transition feedback that I mentioned, right? The direction the ball goes when it falls out, right? That says nothing about your main performance goal of how hard you're throwing the ball, how accurately you're throwing the baseball, but what it tells you is your search going in the right direction, right? If the ball's still falling backwards, you're not searching in the right direction. If the ball starts to go sideways, you're keep doing what you're doing. And when the ball goes more and more forward, it's giving you more and more indication of the solution you're using is getting more and more effective. But again, we're adding something to practice, this weird ball that makes it so that your a constraint, in this case, a task constraint, which makes it so your old solution, set forearm flyout, is no longer effective in achieving this new goal we've given you. Right? That's the whole idea of the constraint set approach, right? And there's a million other examples that you can think of. We talk about different sports, right? This is, small-sided games, creates a constraint to move the ball more, use space more, pass more. This is something we like to do. I took this from Alex Arama from teaching a kid how to do layups. So you have a defender who's going to come at different angles and try to block the shot, occlusion glasses, changing dribbling around cones to playing soccer tag, adding nets, multiple nets on a. But the fun thing about the constraint set approach is you can be very creative. There's a whole bunch of different things you can do. It's a lot of fun. Okay. Why do we want to do this? What are the benefits of the constraint set approach, right? There's a growing body of evidence that shows there's a lot of benefits. So first of all, in terms of performance, right? I've done a couple of baseball studies. There's studies on volleyball, for example. Um, when you train in this way, you get better performance outcomes. And the in particular, the performance is more adaptable, right? Because people learn to find a movement solution that's working for this new constraint you're giving them. They can better adapt to the changes and constraints that occur in competition. They're better decision makers, right? So there's a growing body of evidence in terms of actual performance, in particular adaptability, being able to maintain performance under a variety of different conditions. Okay. The second line of evidence, there's more creativity and individuality. Right? This is a study showing training methods like the constraint set approach, which encourage lots of variability in your movement solution, leads to more creative um, play in the game in soccer. It also tends to lead to more intrinsic motivation, a greater sense of autonomy, right? Particularly if you allow the athlete some choice in the constraint. That's something we like to do. I like to do is allow athletes kind of constrained choice. We have a few different constraints that they could use. We ask them, okay, in this next block, you pick which one you want to use. That's really a good way to promote autonomy and intrinsic motivation. And finally, injury prevention, right? There's a growing and really interesting body of research showing that this type of coaching, which encourages variability in movement, the constraints that approach, one, it reduces markers for risk like acute injury, ACL injury. Here's a couple studies that have looked at before and after training, they constraints that approach training, they looked at forces and kinematics of cutting maneuvers. And they found that after training with the constraints that approach, there was reduced risk factors, reduced forces, ground reaction forces, and better angles when you cut. So there's less chance for acute injury. This is a recent stalker study that's really important. I think that I talk a lot about with on the teams I work with now is right. What this study did was they tested athletes on the fundamentals of soccer, right? Passing and shooting on a really simple kind of course with cones. And what they did was between the pre and post test, they trained players two ways. One, they trained very prescriptive way where they taught them exactly how to pass and they corrected them. Or they used a constraints led approach where they played small sided games, they added different constraints in terms of whether they were to maintain possession or try to move the ball. And what they found was both resulted in equal performance, but the constraints that approach you achieve that in far less touches, right? And this is something I try to promote with the teams I work with now, right? Doing constraints that approach practice, which is more representative, more variable, more game like, it's just a better, more effective use of practice time. Doing the same repetitive activity we've done over and over and over again with an athlete where it's completely predictable, there's no decisions, there's no affordances, right? Is wearing them out, right? Through hours and hours of chronic, is just wearing them out doing this. It's unnecessary practice, right? It's not effective use of practice time. If you can do a little bit of that to do get their confidence level up and ready for the game, but that we do way too much of that, I think, in my opinion. Okay. So, and the other thing I'll point out coming up within the seminar, right? One of the reasons I think the CLA works is it incorporates a lot of the other things you're going to hear about today. CLA is essentially an implicit learning, right? You're learning to find a new movement solution without explicitly knowing what it is or thinking about it. It involves an external focus of attention in most cases. When I tell you to get you to focus on the new bat or hitting a ball over a barrier or whatever, I'm getting you focused on an object in the external environment, not on your mechanics. And then the key ingredients that we use in constraint set approach, which we call representative learning design, which I didn't really go into a lot today, but I went through in separate presentations. That's what we know leads to positive transfer of training, right? So it's this constraint set approach is optimally designed for transfer of training, in my opinion. Okay, that's it for this presentation on the constraint set approach. Here is my shameless promotions slide with my website. You can find everything about me at perceptionaction.com, the podcast, all my new books. I have a new book, How to Be an Ecological Coach, which is coming out soon. And thank you very much for listening.